as human beings, we don't only ask, how do things work? Or how do we get to a certain point? We ask the why.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
And when you say the pursuit of truth is an end in and of itself, we can marvel at how something works and we want to know why. It's the beginning of scientific inquiry. Also, moral questions are questions about why. And what I find too often is that by focusing simply on the how questions, students aren't being given the chance to ask these why questions. And this is what Maritain was warning about. And I one day, you might enjoy this story, Robbie, I one day was preparing to teach Maritain and contrast him to another very influential educator named Paulo Freire.
Oh, yes. Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yeah, so I was reading very carefully Pedagogy of the Oppressed and trying to give it the most sympathetic reading I could. And then I did this because I was snowed in Chicago, and I decided to go watch football all day on a Sunday and take notes in my book, right? Well, one of the workers in the restaurant came up to me and asked me, ma'am, what are you reading? So I thought, oh, this is great. Here's a young Latino. I'm going to explain to him Paulo Freire's view of education, which is essentially that education needs to speak to somebody's own experience, and it needs to be dialogical. And then he said, oh, well, that sounds interesting. I'm reading a really good book right now too. And I said, what's that book? And he said, Orthodoxy.
By G.K. Chesterton.
That's right. Now, and then he explains to me that he was fascinated by Chesterton's life because he was asking these questions about religious truth and whether or not the Catholic faith could ultimately be true. And I just started to laugh because part of what happens in Paulo Freire's view of what he's arguing is that actually the end of education is consciousness raising about our political and social situation. And what Maritain says in response to that is, look, we have to care about social questions and political questions, but those aren't the most fundamental questions. The most fundamental questions are about our human good. And if we can't answer those questions, we're going to get the social and political questions really, really wrong. Exactly. And I was thinking, this young man in Chicago, of course he cares about social questions and politics, but he also cares about why. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you then, Robbie, to follow along with this, right? It's a why question. Why is it so hard to have a dialogue about the nature of the human person, who we are as human beings? When I raise this question myself, people don't often want to talk about who we are as human beings. They just want to get on to the practical things. Why is it so hard to ask this fundamental question about what is human nature? And yeah, that's what I want to know from you.
Well, I think there are different impediments for different people. Some people have essentially adopted a pragmatist approach to life. There's no point in speculating about questions that aren't of immediate practical significance. And my response to them is, those questions, while they're deep and while they're perennial, they've been asked by human beings going all the way back, and they will be asked, I hope, going all the way forward as long as there are human beings. They are, in a certain sense, the most practical questions to ask, because there's no point in choosing one course of action over another unless you know at some level why you are doing it. And sometimes very important life choices that we make depend on where we come down on the great existential questions, the great questions of meaning and value. So they're much more practical than pragmatists generally give them credit for being. Now, that's something that Chesterton himself, I think, noticed, and you get that, it's brought out in his book, Orthodoxy, a book he wrote, by the way, as you'll recall, Margarita, before he was a Catholic. Orthodoxy is in the pre-Catholic, the long pre-Catholic Chesterton period. But you don't have to be a Christian or even a Catholic at all or you don't have to be a Catholic or even a Christian at all, I should say, to appreciate the force and importance and truth of what Chesterton is suggesting to us there. These questions are very practical questions. They are questions about how you lead a life. The fact that they're deep questions, that they cannot be given a ready, off-the-shelf answer, that they force us to think very, very deeply, that they're debatable, that reasonable people of goodwill can disagree about them. That doesn't mean that they are not of practical significance. They're very practical significance. Now, for some people, the impediment isn't so much that they've adopted a pragmatist view of life, it's that they're ideologically locked into the idea that questions like the great questions of meaning and value do not admit of answers. So they've already got that as a dogma. They often claim not to be dogmatists. In fact, they often claim to object to religion because it's dogmatic. What an irony. In fact, they're being dogmatic, they're being dogmatists because they are dogmatically supposing that there are no answers to these deep, important, admittedly debatable questions on which reasonable people of goodwill can disagree. Someone who's not dogmatic will not begin with any such assumption, but will just try to begin thinking through those questions and see where your reflection, drawing on the best that's been thought and said, if possible, drawing on the great thinkers, Plato and Aristotle and St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, and Maimonides and Alfarabi and Luther and Locke and Tocqueville and Lincoln, up to Buber and Maritain and Chesterton, drawing on what others have said, other great figures have said, try to think your way through the problems. Now, it might be that your conclusion ultimately is there are no answers to these questions, but you shouldn't start with that. I don't think that's right, actually, but even if that's your conclusion, you shouldn't start with that as your premise. You need to reason your way to that conclusion and have reasons for drawing it. And even then, the conclusion would have to be tentative because you're trying to prove a negative. You should still try to figure out what it's all about, what life really is all about, what the meaning of it is, why we do the things we do, why we get up in the morning, why we try to treat other people with dignity, the dignity that we think they are due as human beings. We don't treat them just as bugs that can be squashed. And in fact, we regard as monsters figures like Hitler or Pol Pot or Mao Zedong who think of people as just like bugs to be squashed.